Little girl hide under a Hell's Angels table to escape her stepdad. What happens next? The bar went silent when the door slammed open, but no one noticed the small pair of shoes hiding under the biggest biker's table. The little girl hadn't planned it. She had simply run and crawled under the only place that felt safe. What happened next would change every life in that room. The rain had started sometime after noon. Not the loud kind that drums against roofs and windows, but the quiet kind that falls like a long sigh over a tired town. Outside the iron lantern asterisk, puddles stretched along the cracked asphalt like dull mirrors reflecting the gray November sky. A flickering neon motorcycle sign buzzed in the window, casting red light over the empty parking lot. Inside the bar, the air smelled of motor oil, coffee, and the faint bite of whiskey. It was 3:12 in the afternoon. Too early for a crowd. 3 bikers sat near the pool table, arguing quietly about carburetors. An older bartender named Ray Holloway wiped down the counter with slow, practiced movements. And at the corner table near the emergency exit sat Marcus, Grave, Dalton ***. Everyone called him Grave. At 46, he carried the heavy stillness of someone who had seen too much and said too little about it. 6'3", broad shoulders, a thick gray beard that hid the scar running across his jaw. His leather cut rested on the back of his chair, the unmistakable *** Hell's Angels patch stitched across it, worn soft with years of wind and road dust. Grave wasn't drinking much, just a glass of bourbon he had been nursing for nearly an hour. The kind of slow drinking that meant a man was thinking. Outside, a pickup truck sped past the bar. A moment later, the alley door creaked open. Not wide, just enough for a small body to slip through. At first, no one noticed. Then Ray froze. Standing in the doorway was a little girl, 7 years old, maybe 8. Her pink coat hung crooked on her thin shoulders. Her dark hair stuck to her face in damp strands, and her sneakers didn't match. One was blue, one was white. Her chest rose and fell too fast. Her wide eyes scanned the room the way animals look for somewhere to hide. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then she saw Grave, the beard, the leather, the enormous boots beneath the table. For one brief second, fear flashed across her face. Then she made a decision. The girl hurried across the room, dropped to her knees beside his chair, and disappeared under his table. Grave looked down slowly. Under the table, the little girl clutched the metal table leg like it was the only thing keeping the world from falling apart. She held her breath. Grave lifted his bourbon, took a slow sip, and stared calmly at the door, because deep down he already knew something else was about to walk through it. The bar stayed quiet, too quiet. Under the table, the girl's breathing was fast and shallow. Grave could hear it between the slow tick of the wall clock and the hum of the refrigerator behind the bar. She was trying not to cry, trying not to make a sound. But fear has its own rhythm, and it echoed through the small space beneath the table. Grave rested his heavy boot beside her small shoe, not touching, just close. A silent signal, you're not alone. He didn't look down again. Men like him understood something important about frightened children. Too much attention can scare them more. Across the room, Ray the bartender stared at him. Grave gave the smallest nod. Ray understood. He poured a glass of water and walked over. Without a word, he placed it at the edge of the table. Grave lowered it to the floor. A tiny hand appeared from the shadows and grabbed it quickly. The girl drank like she hadn't had water all day. Then the door slammed open, hard. The sound cracked through the bar like a gunshot. Every head turned. A man stood in the doorway, breathing hard, 38, thick shoulders, work boots covered in mud. His face burned red with anger and cold wind. His eyes swept the room like a spotlight, searching, hungry. "Anyone seen a little girl?" he demanded. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the heavy edge of someone used to being obeyed. Ray leaned on the bar. "Can't say I have." The man stepped further inside. His eyes scanned every corner, every booth, every shadow. "Brown hair," he continued. "Pink coat, she's my stepdaughter." Under the table, the girl froze, her fingers tightened around the table leg. Grave saw it. He took another sip of bourbon, slow, calm. The man's gaze finally landed on Grave, then the leather cut on the chair behind him, the Hell's Angels patch. For a moment, something flickered in the man's expression. Not fear, but caution. Still, he kept walking forward. "I'm just trying to bring her home," he said. Grave leaned back in his chair, studying him, measuring him. Then he spoke for the first time, low, even. "You look like a man who lost something." The man frowned. "Yeah," he said, "my patience." Under the table, the girl silently shook her head. Grave noticed, and something behind his calm brown eyes hardened. The man stopped 3 steps from the table. close enough now that Grave could see the tiny broken blood vessels in his nose, the kind that came from drinking too much, or hitting things, or people. "What's your problem?" the man asked. Grave studied him the way mechanics study engines. "Looking for what's broken. My problem?" Grave said slowly. He set his glass down. "I don't have one." The man's jaw tightened. "Then move your chair," he said. Grave raised one eyebrow. "Why?" The man gestured toward the floor. "Because I want to look under that table." The room went still. Ray behind the bar stopped wiping the counter. The bikers near the pool table turned slightly, not obvious, but ready. Grave crossed one boot over the other, relaxed, comfortable. "You looking for a dog?" he asked. The man's voice dropped. "I'm looking for my kid." Under the table, the girl squeezed her eyes shut. Grave could see the small tremble in her hands. He leaned forward slightly. Just enough for the man to see his eyes clearly. "Funny thing about kids," Grave said. "They usually run away from something." The man's face darkened. "You calling me a bad parent?" Grave shrugged. "I didn't say that." A long silence stretched between them. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Finally, the man exhaled sharply. "Look," he muttered. "She scares easy. Her real dad died last year. She runs sometimes." Grave watched him carefully. People tell the truth with their words, but the whole truth lives in their eyes, and this man's eyes were full of something ugly. Impatience, possession, anger, not concern. Grave reached for his bourbon again. "You might want to check the diner 2 blocks over," he said casually. "Kids like pancakes." The man stared at him, thinking, calculating. Under the table, the girl slowly shook her head again. Grave noticed. Then the man looked around the bar once more, at the bikers, at Ray, at the quiet tension in the room. Finally, he stepped backward. "Yeah," he muttered. "Maybe she went that way." He turned toward the door. But before leaving, he looked back at Grave, long, hard, like someone memorizing a face. Then he pushed the door open and disappeared into the rain. The bar stayed silent. 3 seconds, 5 seconds, 7. Finally, Grave looked down. "She's gone," he said quietly. A small voice answered from the shadows. "For now." 17 minutes passed before the girl came out, not slowly, not cautiously. She simply crawled out from under the table, stood up, and climbed into the chair across from Grave like it had always belonged to her. For a moment, no one spoke. The girl looked even smaller sitting there. Her pink coat was torn near the sleeve, her knees were scraped, and there was a faint purple mark on her wrist. Grave noticed it immediately. His jaw tightened slightly. "What's your name, kid?" he asked gently. She hesitated, then whispered, "Emma." Her voice was so soft it almost disappeared under the hum of the bar lights. "How old are you, Emma?" 7. Grave nodded. "That man your stepdad." Emma didn't answer. She just stared at the table. After a moment, she nodded. Ray slowly approached with another glass of water. Emma took it carefully with both hands. "Thank you," she whispered. Her manners were careful, precise. The kind children learn when they are afraid of doing something wrong. Grave leaned back in his chair again. "Your mom know you're here?" Emma shook her head. "She's working." "Where?" "At the hospital." Grave exchanged a look with Ray. Then he asked the question carefully. "Why were you running, Emma?" Her hands tightened around the glass. For several seconds she said nothing. Then she looked up. Her blue eyes were filled with something far too old for a 7-year-old. "He gets mad when I cry," she whispered. The room seemed to grow colder. Grave said nothing. Emma swallowed. "And I cry a lot." Ray quietly stepped away, giving them space. Grave studied the little girl sitting across from him, small, thin, trying very hard to be brave. Then he asked the most important question. "Does he hurt you?" Emma stared at the table again. For a long moment she didn't move, then she lifted her sleeve slightly. Just enough to show the bruise forming on her arm. Grave's fingers tightened around his glass. His knuckles turned white. Across the room, the bikers by the pool table watched silently, because every man there knew something had just changed. And none of them were going to pretend they hadn't seen it. Grave stood slowly. The chair legs scraped softly against the floor. Emma flinched at the sound. He noticed immediately. "Hey," he said gently, "it's okay." His voice had lost the gravel edge it usually carried. Now it sounded softer, careful, like someone speaking to a wounded animal. Emma looked up at him. "You're really big," she said quietly. Grave almost smiled. "Yeah," he said. "I've been told." Ray walked over again. "What are you thinking?" he asked under his breath. Grave looked toward the door where the man had left. Rain still streaked the glass. "He's coming back," Grave said calmly. Ray nodded. "Probably." Emma's small hands trembled around the water glass. "He always comes back," she whispered. Grave crouched slightly so he was closer to her eye level. "Listen to me, Emma." She looked at him. If he walks through that door again, Graves said quietly, he's not taking you anywhere tonight. Emma searched his face. Children are good at knowing when adults are lying. What if he gets mad? She asked. Graves' eyes shifted briefly toward the bikers across the room. Three large men who had quietly moved closer without anyone asking. Then he looked back at her. Kid, he said softly, mad doesn't scare me. Outside, a pair of headlights turned into the parking lot. Ray saw them first, then Grave. A familiar pickup truck rolled slowly toward the bar. Emma followed their eyes to the window, her face drained of color. That's him, she whispered. The truck engine shut off. A door slammed outside. Heavy footsteps approached the entrance. Inside the iron lantern, 5 grown men stood quietly, waiting. Grave placed his leather cut over Emma's shoulders like a blanket. The huge patch nearly swallowed her whole. Then he turned toward the door. And for the first time that afternoon, Marcus Grave Dalton looked ready for a fight. The door opened slowly this time, not kicked in, not slammed. Just pushed inward with a quiet creak that somehow felt more dangerous. Cold wind slipped into the iron lantern along with the man from the pickup truck. Craig Bowman. His boots thudded against the wooden floor as he stepped inside again, rain dripping from the shoulders of his gray jacket. But this time he wasn't pretending. His eyes went straight to the corner table, straight to Grave, and straight to the small figure wrapped inside the massive leather cut. Emma sat frozen in the chair. The Hell's Angels patch asterisk hung down around her shoulders like armor she didn't fully understand. Craig stopped walking. For a moment, confusion flickered across his face. Then anger returned twice as strong. Well, he muttered, there she is. No one spoke. The pool table bikers had quietly shifted positions, forming an invisible wall behind Graves' chair. Ray stood behind the bar, his hand resting below the counter where the phone sat ready. Craig pointed toward Emma. You get down here, he snapped. Emma didn't move. Her fingers gripped the edge of the leather cut tighter. Craig's voice sharpened. I said get over here. Graves slowly stood. The movement was calm, unhurried, but when a man that large rises to his full height, rooms tend to feel smaller. Craig's eyes lifted to meet his. You got something to say? Craig asked. Graves shrugged slightly. Just thinking. About what? Graves looked at Emma for half a second, then back at Craig. About why a little girl runs 3 blocks in the rain just to hide under a stranger's table. Craig scoffed. She's dramatic. Emma's hands trembled again. Grave noticed. He turned his head slightly toward Ray. Call Sandra, he said quietly. Craig frowned. Who the hell is Sandra? Ray picked up the phone. Someone who asks questions for a living. Craig stepped forward fast. Hang that up. But the 3 bikers behind Grave moved at the same time, not aggressively, just enough to block the path. Craig stopped. Now the anger in his eyes was starting to mix with something else. The realization that he might not control this room. You people have no idea what you're doing, he muttered. Grave folded his arms. Maybe, he said. But tonight we're learning. Rain tapped harder against the windows. Inside the bar, the silence stretched like a wire pulled too tight. Craig stood in the middle of the room, breathing through his nose, his eyes moving between the men blocking his path. 3 bikers, all large, all calm, and none of them smiling. He turned back toward Grave. You kidnapping my kid now? Craig said. Grave tilted his head slightly. Your kid, Craig's jaw flexed. My stepdaughter. Emma lowered her eyes again. Grave noticed the difference. Words matter, especially the ones people choose without thinking. Ray spoke from behind the bar. Sandra's on her way. Craig barked a laugh. You called a social worker. Something like that, Ray replied. Craig rubbed his face with both hands, like a man trying to decide which version of anger he wanted to use. Look, he muttered, you don't know the situation. Grave nodded slowly. You're right. Then he gestured toward Emma. So explain it. Craig looked at her, and for the first time since entering the bar, his voice softened. But it wasn't kindness. It was the tone people use when they want something. Emma, he said. Come here, sweetheart. Emma didn't move. Her small fingers clutched the leather cut again. Craig's patience snapped instantly. For God's sake, Emma. The sudden volume made her flinch hard. Her chair scraped back an inch. Graves' eyes darkened. He stepped forward once. The floor creaked under his weight. Lower your voice, he said quietly. Craig looked at him. You threatening me? Graves shook his head slowly. No. Then he leaned slightly closer. I'm educating you. Behind them, one of the bikers chuckled softly. Craig pointed a finger at Graves' chest. You think wearing that patch makes you a hero? Grave looked down at the finger, then back up at Craig. No, he said. It just reminds people I don't scare easy. Another long silence filled the bar. Then Emma spoke for the first time since Craig returned, her voice barely above a whisper. "He broke my music box." Craig turned sharply. "What?" Emma looked at the table. "The one Dad gave me." The room grew very still. Craig's face hardened. "That was an accident." Emma shook her head slowly. "You threw it." Graves' eyes lifted, and something behind them turned cold. No one moved for several seconds. Ray's voice came low and steady. "You break many things at home?" Craig's eyes flashed. "Mind your business." Grave nodded slightly. "Emma is starting to look like my business." Craig stepped forward again. But the bikers shifted once more, quiet as shadows. He stopped, his hands curled into fists. "Her mother married me," he snapped. "I take care of that house." Grave studied him. "Taking care of something usually means protecting it." Craig scoffed. "You people don't know anything about families." Graves' eyes drifted briefly to the rain-streaked window. For a moment something old passed across his face, a memory, a ghost. Then he looked back at Craig. "You might be right," he said, "but I know what fear looks like." Emma's small voice came again. "He gets mad when Mom works nights." Craig spun toward her. "That's enough." The sharpness in his voice made her flinch again. Graves' hands slowly curled into fists at his sides. The door opened suddenly behind Craig. Cold air rushed inside. A woman stepped in, shaking rain from her coat. She carried a leather bag and tired eyes. Ray exhaled with relief. "Sandra," he said, "good timing." Sandra Merchant had the calm face of someone who had spent 20 years walking into tense rooms. She looked around the iron lantern once, taking everything in. The bikers, Craig. Emma wrapped in the oversized leather cut, and Graves standing between them. She set her bag on the nearest table. "Someone want to explain what's happening?" she asked. Craig answered first. "These idiots won't let me take my stepdaughter home." Sandra's eyes moved to Emma. "Is that true?" Emma hesitated, then whispered, "I ran away." Sandra nodded gently. "Why?" Emma stared at the floor again. Craig groaned. "Oh, come on." Sandra held up a hand. "Let her speak." Emma swallowed hard. "He gets mad." Sandra's voice stayed calm. "What kind of mad?" Emma lifted her sleeve again. The bruise had darkened. Sandra's eyes sharpened. Craig immediately shook his head. "That's from falling." Emma whispered something so quietly only Grave heard it. "He pushed me." Grave's jaw clenched. Sandra stepped closer. "Emma," she said softly, "do you feel safe going home tonight?" The little girl didn't answer. Instead, she slowly shook her head. The bar fell silent again. Craig exploded. "This is ridiculous." Sandra turned toward him. "Lower your voice." Craig laughed harshly. "You believe a kid over an adult." Sandra met his stare. "I believe patterns." She glanced again at the bruise, then at Emma's trembling hands, then at the men in the room who clearly weren't letting this slide. Craig pointed at Grave. "This biker's filling her head with nonsense." Sandra raised an eyebrow. "Did he touch her?" "No." "Did he threaten you?" Craig hesitated. "No." Sandra nodded. "Then right now he's just the man who called me." Grave leaned back slightly against the table. For the first time all evening, Emma's shoulders relaxed just a little. Craig rubbed his temples. "You're blowing this out of proportion." Sandra's voice remained steady. "Maybe." Then she pulled out her phone, "But we're going to make sure." Craig's expression changed, because suddenly, this situation was moving somewhere he couldn't control. The rain finally began to slow outside. Drops slid slowly down the iron lantern windows like tired tears. Inside, Sandra finished speaking quietly into her phone, then she slipped it back into her coat pocket. Craig watched her carefully. "Who did you call?" he asked. Sandra didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked at Emma again. Then at the bruise, then at Grave. Finally, she spoke. "Emma and her mother will be staying somewhere else tonight." Craig's face flushed red. "The hell they will." Sandra folded her arms. "Actually, they will." Craig stepped forward again. "You can't just take someone's kid." Sandra didn't raise her voice. "I can when there's probable danger." Craig laughed bitterly. "You got proof." Sandra gestured toward Emma's arm. "That's a start." Craig shook his head. "That's nothing." Grave finally spoke again. "Funny thing about bruises," he said quietly. "They usually have stories attached." Craig turned toward him. "You mind staying out of this?" Grave shrugged. "I tried." Sandra looked between the two men, then asked calmly, "Mr. Bowman, have the police ever been called to your house before?" Craig's silence lasted just a fraction too long. Sandra noticed, so did everyone else. Craig muttered something under his breath. "That was one time." Emma whispered from the chair. "It was 3." Craig spun around. "Emma!" The shout echoed off the bar walls. Emma shrank into the leather cut again, and that was the moment something shifted completely in the room. Just one step. Grave took one, but the entire room felt the shift. Some men fight harder when they feel cornered. Others begin calculating escape routes. Craig stepped back. Craig Bowman looked like a man doing math he didn't like. Sandra watched him carefully. "You should go home," she said calmly. "Emma won't be coming with you tonight." Craig laughed once, sharp and humorless. "You think her mother's going to agree to that?" Sandra shrugged slightly. "She deserves to know what's happening." Emma sat very still beneath the giant leather cut. The heavy patch covered most of her shoulders, the faded wings stretching across her small back like something meant to protect her. Craig looked at her again. For a moment his anger softened into something more complicated. "Emma," he said, quieter now, "you know I didn't mean to scare you." Emma stared at the table. "You always say that." The words were soft, but they cut deeper than shouting ever could. Craig rubbed his forehead. "You don't understand adult problems." Grave finally spoke again. "Kids understand fear just fine." Craig ignored him and kept talking to Emma. "Your mom works nights, I handle everything else. Food, bills, that house." Emma whispered, "You yell a lot." Craig's patience snapped again. "I raise my voice because someone has to keep order." The sudden outburst echoed through the bar. Emma flinched hard. Grave moved instantly, one heavy step forward. "Enough." The word wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a closing door. Craig looked at him again. Something in Grave's eyes had changed now. Not anger, not even threat. Just certainty, the kind that tells a man his time in the room is over. Sandra stepped between them slightly. "The police are on their way," she said calmly. Craig blinked. "You called the cops." Sandra nodded. "Standard procedure." The color drained slightly from Craig's face, because suddenly this wasn't just an argument in a biker bar. Now it was a record, a report, a story that would follow him home. Craig looked around the room one last time. At the men who hadn't moved, at the little girl who refused to look at him, and at the biker standing between them like a wall. Then Craig Bowman turned and walked toward the door. Outside, the rain had almost stopped. The door closed behind Craig with a dull click. For several seconds, no one spoke. The tension that had filled the iron lantern slowly began to loosen, like a rope finally relaxing after being pulled too tight. Emma's shoulders dropped. Just a little, Grave noticed immediately. He crouched beside her chair. "You okay, kid?" Emma nodded slowly. "I think so." Sandra sat across from her. "Your mom's going to meet us soon," she said gently. Emma looked nervous again. "Is she mad?" Sandra smiled softly. "No." Ray poured a cup of hot chocolate and slid it across the table. Emma wrapped both hands around it like it was the warmest thing she had ever touched. Steam curled upward in soft white spirals. Grave watched quietly, then Emma asked something unexpected. "Why did you help me?" The question hung in the air. Grave leaned back against the table edge. For a moment he didn't answer. Instead he looked toward the rain-streaked window. His voice, when it came, was quieter than anyone expected. "Had a daughter once." The entire room went still again. Emma looked up. "Where is she?" Grave swallowed slowly. "Gone." No one asked how. Some stories live in the silence between words. Emma stared at him for several seconds. Then she did something small but powerful. She slid her chair closer and wrapped her arms around his huge waist. The hug was sudden, unplanned, but completely sincere. Grave froze. Men like him rarely received hugs, especially from 7-year-olds. Slowly, awkwardly, he rested one large hand on the back of her head. Across the room, one of the bikers wiped his nose quietly. Ray pretended to polish a glass. Sandra watched the moment carefully, because sometimes healing begins in places no one expects, like a biker bar on a rainy afternoon. Emma leaned back finally. "You would have liked my dad," she said. Grave smiled faintly. "I bet I would have." 20 minutes later, flashing red and blue lights painted the bar windows. A police cruiser rolled slowly into the parking lot. Emma stiffened slightly. Grave noticed. "They're here to help," he said gently. The door opened again. 2 officers stepped inside. Sandra greeted them calmly and began explaining the situation. Emma listened quietly, sipping her hot chocolate. Grave stayed nearby, not hovering, just present. After several minutes, one officer approached Emma carefully. "Hey there," he said kindly. "I'm Officer Ramirez." Emma gave a small nod. "We're going to make sure you're safe tonight, okay?" Emma looked at Grave first, almost like she needed confirmation. Grave nodded once. "It's all right." Outside, another car pulled into the parking lot. A tired woman rushed toward the door. Her hospital scrubs were still visible beneath her coat. The moment she saw Emma, her face crumpled. Emma. The little girl jumped from her chair and ran straight into her mother's arms. They held each other tightly, both crying now. "I'm so sorry," her mother whispered over and over. Emma shook her head. "It's okay, Mom." Sandra quietly spoke with the officers while the reunion continued. After a few minutes, Emma's mother walked toward Grave. Her eyes were still wet. "You're the one who called." Grave nodded slightly. She reached out and squeezed his hand. "Thank you." Grave shrugged gently. "Kid did most of the work." Emma peeked out from behind her mother, still wrapped in the oversized leather cut. "Can I keep this for a little while?" she asked. Grave smiled. "Yeah." The jacket hung nearly to her ankles, but she wore it proudly, like armor. The police eventually left. Sandra arranged a temporary place for Emma and her mother to stay while the situation at home was investigated. The iron lantern slowly returned to its usual quiet rhythm, but the afternoon had changed something. Emma stood near the door with her mother, still wearing the giant leather cut. She looked back at Grave. "Will I see you again?" Grave thought about that. Life on the road rarely offered promises, but he crouched slightly anyway. "Maybe." Emma studied him carefully. "You're not scary," she said. The bikers behind him laughed softly. Grave scratched his beard. "Don't tell anyone." Emma giggled for the first time that day. Then she hugged him again, a little tighter this time. Before leaving, she slipped something onto the table beside him, a small, folded paper. Grave opened it after she walked outside. Inside was a child's drawing, a big biker, a tiny girl, and a table between them. Above it were crooked crayon letters. "Thank you for letting me hide." Grave stared at the picture for a long moment, then folded it carefully and placed it inside his wallet, somewhere he would never lose it. Later that night, the iron lantern was nearly empty again. Rain clouds had finally cleared. Moonlight reflected in the puddles outside. Grave sat at the same table where everything had started. The bourbon glass in front of him remained untouched. Ray walked over. "You did a good thing today." Grave shrugged. "Kid just needed somewhere to sit." Ray nodded, still. Across the room, the bikers were laughing quietly over a game of pool. Life had resumed its slow rhythm, but something about the room felt warmer. Grave pulled the drawing from his wallet again. The crooked crayon biker looked ridiculous, but the tiny, smiling girl beside him looked safe, and that mattered. Outside, a motorcycle engine roared to life in the distance. Grave stood up, pulling on his leather cut. For years he had believed the road